Welcome back, folks. We're in the home stretch here. We're getting ready for our final full session of the afternoon. And that session is called The Opportunities and Challenges of Tracking High-Value Assets. That's going to feature Dan Jameson of Particle and Tom Bull of Dynamis. Dan Jameson is the general manager at Particle, overseeing all of our delivery functions. He's been with the company for nearly 6 years and has worked closely with many of our enterprise customers, advising them on the development and evolution of their IoT strategies. One of the most colorful and dynamic personalities at Particle, Dan Jameson.
Thanks, Michael. I'm excited to join you guys. Thank you to all of our speakers who joined us earlier. I hope those attending the session found it to be valuable. And thank you to Tom for joining us and taking a bit out of what I know is a busy schedule to chat with some folks about Dynamis and asset tracking. So I thought I'd just get started here by asking you to spend a little time introducing yourself, tell us a bit about Dynamis as an organization, and maybe give a quick background on your IoT initiative as it stands today.
Sure thing, Dan. First off, I do want to thank you for inviting me. And I also want to thank Particle for having me here at a virtual Spectra. It's an honor to share our lessons learned and our experience with Particle and the Particle Studios. A little bit of background about myself. I spent the last 14 years as a software developer of the Cobra emergency management and response software solution. And then the last 2 years, I've been a solutions engineer, which means I work with potential and existing customers to help understand their business needs and then translate those into requirements for a development team to implement. In addition to that, I fulfill the role of a product owner in the Agile Scrum methodology, ensuring that whatever the development team produces is of high quality and is what the stakeholders need. A little bit about Dynamis, the company I work for. We're an international provider of security, technology, and preparedness solutions for high-risk enterprises that require comprehensive solutions. We range from training, threat and hazard identification, preparedness assessments and analysis, exercise program support, mitigation and risk management. In addition to that, we are the producers of the Cobra Emergency Management software solution, a cloud-based common operating picture, which enables shared situational awareness in emergencies. So from your first responders, handling a local incident all the way up to a wildfire response or a hurricane, earthquake type of response, and everything in between. We're used from the local all the way to the national level. Some of the more notable Cobra customers, and we're gonna get into more of a deeper dive on a few of them, I think, today. First and foremost is the Air National Guard. They use Cobra for their domestic operations and emergency management, which means all 90 Air National Guard wings and 54 joint operation centers in the United States use Cobra daily for all of their response and training. We are on a number of Air Force installations domestically, and we are used in a number of foreign countries. The Kingdom or country of Belgium uses us for their National Incident Command System. So every incident and response within the Kingdom of Belgium, they use Cobra to track and mitigate the response. Used in such high target events like the Tour de France as it goes through Belgium. In Jordan, we're used for infectious disease monitoring, biolabs, vaccines, blood banks, and now emergency response. We're being used in Germany, and we're used in Brazil for both the World Cup and for the Olympics. The reason I'm here today, or was invited here today, was a product we developed jointly with Particle called our Cobra Locator. It's effectively an asset tracker. Personnel, that one right here, an older version, personnel resource tracker that is used for emergency response operations. It's inspired by asset tracking. Now, when we went down this path, Particle didn't have an asset tracking kit, but that is the inspiration. And if you've been in the military, you've worked in military environments overseas, they have a concept called blue force tracking. They need to know where all their soldiers are and where all their assets are. But there's nothing like that domestically. They can't use the same technology for domestic operations and emergency response. So that was kind of the motivation behind it. So what does it do? It reports location, velocity, altitude, every 30 seconds when it's on. Has a 12-hour active mode, a 30-day standby mode. Standby meaning it reports, I think, once an hour, every hour. It's got 1 meter accuracy. That's partially the reason for the size of it. We know we've seen pebbles and small tracking devices that are the size of a large quarter or $50. We made it larger on purpose to get us higher accuracy, and so they wouldn't lose it. If it's too small, you're going to lose it in an emergency response. It's IP67 compliant, which means it'll stay underwater for 1 meter for 1 hour and still be operational. Why would we need that for domestic operations? Think hurricanes. Hurricanes have a lot of high water, and you'll have emergency responders and soldiers dredging through high water, and they need to still operate. And then with particle support, we made 2 different versions of it, a 3G and an LTE version. LTE is where we're moving to, great national coverage, and the 3G version is used mostly for international customers.
Thanks, Tom. That was an awesome background. And you know, the prompt of the session was the opportunities and challenges of tracking high value assets. I can't imagine a higher value asset than an emergency responder. So it's an extremely cool application, and was a fun journey to travel with the folks from Dynamis to help you achieve it. You know, in listening to you talk, I'm curious, you know, how did this initiative sort of come about? You know, and why did you guys decide to pursue it? When you think about sort of the step away from providing robust global software delivered over the cloud to providing a physical device, you know, to track human beings. Like, how did that come about, and how did you guys work through that as a problem set?
Sure. Well, Dynamis has always been mission focused and customer driven. So we are listening to our customers' needs, and we try to find solutions for them. The Air Force and the Air National Guard independently approached us saying we have a critical need for real-time tracking, and we don't have a domestic solution. We want something that works with Cobra in a common operating picture, and we don't want to buy new software. Do you have a solution, or can you point us in the direction of a piece of hardware that'll work with it? We did our research, and we couldn't find appropriate existing hardware off the shelf. And we're not hardware people either. We're software and software solutions. But we saw an interesting business opportunity. You know, the Air National Guard had a lesson learned after Hurricane Harvey, where they had responders from a number of different wings across several different states to evacuate people and get their personnel in for response. So they would take buses and put people on buses, and then remove people from the areas that were impacted. And they didn't know where they were going. They didn't know where their personnel were. They did not know where the evacuees were being sent. And they had a very real problem with that. So we worked with a maker and prototyped an asset tracker, real rudimentary version, and worked with the Air National Guard on use cases, ways that they would benefit from it, and adjusting form factor and figure out what would make sense. Once we had a rough idea of what they needed and the requirements, we were placed on something called the DCP, the Domestic Capability Priorities Book. And we were placed in the top 10 need for the Air National Guard. That means they have to buy it, and there was no solution domestically for that. So we came up with a good idea. We worked with our client and customer to develop that idea, and then a good problem to have, they bought it. So now we had to come up with a solution. Some of the use cases that we worked through while we were developing with them, like I said, tracking those personnel, also locating security teams. So you have security teams that will go either into a fire or an active shooter scenario or something like that, and they need to know where all the security teams are. Also movement of shipments, resources. So the Air National Guard for domestic response has an enormous capability, and we're starting to learn about some of that in our current times. So mobile field hospitals or even ventilators. and they need to be able to track those shipments and resources and be able to pull them back afterwards, because the Air National Guard, while it is a military entity, they're not funded like the active duty. So they need to keep track of all their resources for reuse. So from that, we try to figure out what the business impact would be. And working with Particle, we got the product developed, and we'll, I think, talk a little bit more about that process. But after the fact, we didn't realize what it meant to be a hardware provider. The impact was incredibly positive for our customers and for Dynamis. We expected it to get a good response, but we didn't expect the response that we got, how positive and overwhelming. So that was really rewarding for us in seeing the use. It also severely impacted our division in a positive way, both from a revenue and profit standpoint. Software is highly profitable, hardware is as well, and the services coupled with that. But it required us to develop new skills and in-house capabilities that we never had before. And that did pose some challenges, or it definitely impacted our business and our division.
That is so interesting. You know, and you know, it's definitely a pattern that it's fascinating to listen to you talk about. If I think about our broad swath of customers in different ways where we've seen folks try to solve challenges as it relates to mobility. You know, Dynamis definitely has I would call it the most extreme challenges because of the situations you're operating in. But and so it's a fascinating story and amazing to listen to. You alluded to you know, the current environment. I want to get to that in a minute. You know, also mentioned how your operations and how sort of your business processes may have changed in dealing with hardware, and then as a software company, bringing a hardware product to market, what challenges that presented to Dynamis. I'd love if you could take a minute and talk about sort of the development process and the iteration that you guys went through and what you learned, and then how that those learnings and how you interact with your customers and support them may have changed as you sort of deliver the software that you guys make, or add capabilities to the software you guys make through a vehicle that is hardware.
Sure. Well, this was not our first foray into hardware. For Brazil, for the World Cup and later on the Olympics, they had an interesting use case. Brazil has been using Cobra software since 2011. And as they were ramping up for the World Cup, they have a unique problem. They have a large supply of troops and a limited supply of technology. So whereas other nations, European and maybe the United States, would have solved security problems such as the World Cup by buying a bunch of expensive sensors and placing IoT devices all throughout the various venues, the Brazilians went with a different approach. They asked us to develop a Bluetooth connector to off-the-shelf simple sensors, so radiological, biological, and chem sensors. And then we interfaced with their devices through a software app on a mobile phone, and then sent the information up to Cobra, which would allow subject matter experts to figure out what was going on. So they took soldiers, 18-year-old, 19-year-old soldiers with no understanding of chemical biological response, and basically used them as canaries in a coal mine. They said, wow, turn on your phone and walk around with this piece of hardware, and don't worry if it makes any noises. Low-tech solution, but that was our first foray into kind of a hardware interface, and we realized quickly that it is complicated, and without severe engineering expertise, you're going to fall on your face a lot to get it right. So after that, we started looking at a couple other solutions in emergency management. A few years later, we partnered with a maker to put sensors onto drones. And then we eventually built a prototype locator using a Raspberry Pi just to see if it would work. We quickly realized we wouldn't want to do this in-house. Anything with the locator or any piece of hardware, we just did not want to take on that capability or expertise. It was too steep of a climb. So we've reached out to a couple of traditional military fabricators that we've worked with just for other contracts over the years and see if they were interested. And yes, they were all capable of producing an asset tracker or locator, but they were all coming in at military spec and at thousands of dollars per device because that's what military industrial complex tends to do. So just so happens at the same time we were doing this, I received a Photon developer kit for Christmas. Now, I'm an avid home brewer, and I was trying to figure out how I could use this Photon developer kit, and I ended up building a temperature controller for my fermentation for my brewing. And I saw how easy it was to work with the libraries, work with the hardware, and off-the-shelf components and build something that's useful. And it caused me to go back to the drawing board and do some more research and figure out maybe if particle could be a solution just for the internals, and maybe we build it with particle hardware, but build it in-house. Then we discovered Particle Studios, and that was a huge weight off my shoulders because I did not want to be soldering what ended up being 1,900 different devices on my nights and weekends. So
Yes.
started a nice partnership with Particle Studios. And I think the second part of your question was regarding how, since we released the Cobra locator, how it's impacted government agencies, or
Yeah, I'm curious, and how you interact with them. What is if there's put new requirements on your customers or on yourself in terms of how you support them in deploying the resource and dealing with issues that come up invariably when you're deploying technology.
Sure. Well, it forced us to develop new software products that were related to the Cobra suite, but were more niche. One example is a threat monitoring awareness tool. So we are listening for feeds for earthquakes or hurricanes or lightning, tornadoes, and we're taking those feeds and automatically starting incidents in response. And then tied in with that, since we have the location of emergency responders in the field, we can now work with location, figuring out if they're in a threat area, and then automatically detect them, build reports, so they're alerted, or their managers, both private and commercial and military, can start figuring out where the resources are and get them back to actually making a response. So even a simple call out in the field, hey, earthquake just happened. We know where you're at. Are you okay? It also forced us to move away from running our software on virtual machines on AWS to a software as a solution. We needed to scale both across or breadth and depth wise. And locators were a big part of that. Increased usage, increased our user base, and our drain on our servers or load on our servers. And that might seem like a simple problem to many of the .com industry, but for emergency managers, emergency management software, we were talking in the hundreds of users, not millions of users. So it was a new problem for us. We also, because we had a new product offering, we started to move internationally more. I mentioned Belgium as one of our customers. Well, that forced us to translate into other languages. We were only focused on the US market. And because we had new hardware with new markets opening up, well, we had to translate into native languages, because emergency managers, you don't want to be translating on the fly. You want to be working in your native language. And then we ran into some branding challenges. We had a couple of users, Air Force and International Guard, and they were just emergency managers, mostly chemical, biological responders. And then security forces, so your police and your base force protection saw them and got interested. Well, it seems simple, but the red border of the Cobra locator didn't work well for security forces because they think in blue. So we had to just do a simple branding like that. And because of the increased usage, we had to increase our training and deployment support. We always offered a 3-day training, but we had to offer quick turn trainings that in as little as 4 hours, they could be up with the software and using it for emergency response. As I mentioned before, we've increased our user base, both domestically and moving into states. So joint operation centers. So military, Air National Guard working with your state emergency responders, so your civilians working together to mitigate a disaster.
That is awesome and a great answer. And thanks for such great detail. I want to move quickly to COVID and talk, but one thing I wanted to note, you mentioned a couple times, starting with maker tools and prototyping kits and that space, which I think is fascinating and awesome. I'm curious, do you think that your instinct to do that is related to sort of your background as, you mentioned an expert in agile software development, and sort of thinking about hardware development in a similar way where it's like, constantly building MVPs as opposed to, a more traditional hardware development process?
Oh, it's night and day. You really hit the nail on the head. As software, developers, we iterate rapidly. You have your MVP, you have your agile sprints, 2-3 weeks, whatever they may be, and you're putting out a final product to the end user for review. But with hardware, there's a lot longer lead time. You have to think about components. You have to think about where you're going to get those sources, and then the manufacturing process. So you iterate, which is great. And Particle Studios helped us tremendously with that iteration process, but it wasn't the same. You had to spend a lot more time in the beginning getting your requirements right, getting your understanding of use cases correct, and really get a 90% solution there in the beginning. Now, not everything was fleshed out. We went through a number of firmware iterations, which we could do once we got the hardware right. And sometimes the requirements for the product drove hardware decisions, which caused the firmware to not work as we expected. But the team was great, hand-holding us throughout, identifying where we would run into some problems, and pointing out trade-offs that we'd have to make to get the solution that we needed at the price point that we were looking for.
Very cool, and I appreciate that feedback. The Studios team is a great team, and so I know they'll appreciate the kind words as well. So flipping to COVID for a minute, I think you mentioned earlier in the conversation, how the current environment has definitely impacted Dynamis and your customers. I'm curious, maybe by starting to see how has coronavirus affected Dynamis, and have you seen any of your the current adopters of the locator, the COVID locator, leverage the solution in response to the crisis?
Sure. Well, Dynamis is largely a government contracting company. Now, Cobra is an interesting niche within that. So a majority of the company lives and dies based on government contracts. So some of our contracts haven't been impacted at all. They just got 100% remote working, and that's fine. Unfortunately, some have been canceled outright. We work with student visas and immigration, and those were driven by fees, and those have disappeared. Some have been delayed based on deliveries. So we do on-site training and exercises, and we can't do that right now. We can't travel. So those have just been delayed, and they'll happen once we reopen. Effectively, about 15% of our operations or our staff have been benched, which is impactful to say the least.
Right.
But Dynamis is retaining them. We have a strong commitment to our staff, and as painful as it is to our bottom line, it still doesn't change the fact that we highly value the people at Dynamis, and everyone is an important resource, and you just can't let them go just because there isn't funding. So we're finding a way. Now, that's how Dynamis has been impacted, and those are somewhat negative. But Cobra is emergency management software, and we are in an emergency unlike anything we've witnessed in our lifetimes. We've been in hurricanes, we've been in earthquakes and floods, and those are all impactful events. But a pandemic is a worldwide thing. And traditionally, when domestic operations emergency responders have thought about how to handle events in the United States, they thought about it regionally. So an earthquake in California or on the West Coast can impact 5 or 6 states, but the East Coast will still be able to provide for them. Well, now we have emergency responders activating in all 50 states and 4 territories, all responding with the same thing. So you don't want to profit off a disaster, and we certainly are not. But what we're seeing is a renewed focus on emergency management software and tools. And they realized that they had this tool suite in their back pocket, and they're dusting it off and using it in novel ways. So in the United States, we saw an increase of daily users over 200%. In Belgium, we saw a daily increase of 800%. So yes, so just from our user rate alone, and users that weren't typically familiar with the system on a day-to-day basis, they'd only use it once a month or whenever there was a disaster or an exercise. So now that we're seeing daily use. Speaking specifically about locators, I just heard the other day in preparation for this conference that one of our Air National Guard wings in Nevada is using the locators to track all of their ventilator deliveries. So for all the state usage of ventilators, where hospitals, what mobile field hospitals that they're moving to, they need to be able to track where those locators are so they don't disappear and they can move them to where they're needed. So they use the locators to track all the deliveries, and so the state emergency managers can understand where their assets are.
That's super cool and fun to talk about and think that you guys are making an impact and giving people a resource in that way. That's awesome. You talked about it's crazy to think about, obvious in retrospect, right? That this is for the first time you have sort of 50 states turning on disaster response all at the same time. Obviously, I think disaster preparedness will change, and how governments and society thinks about it. What if any early indications are you seeing, or conversations are you guys having at Dynamis? And when thinking about both your IoT strategy and more broadly, how do you think that change will manifest itself, looking forward, and how are you guys thinking about being in a position to help those agencies make those changes?
Well, we're rapidly prototyping solutions right now from a software standpoint. We're looking at how internally we're responding to the disaster and how our partners and our customers are responding, and figuring out where the gaps are. And we're releasing new tools and new solutions and changes to solutions in as little as a week, because this is evolving. We're all learning together how to best respond to a pandemic. From our development teams have been excellent. They've been taking requirements that we've been gathering and prototyping and releasing in just lightning speed. From a government standpoint, we're seeing a rapid turnaround in requests for proposals or requests for information. Usually that lead time would be months. We're seeing RFPs drop in weeks, and responses to RFPs are coming in as little as 48 hours from the government. So they're being responsive. They're trying to find novel ways to combat this pandemic, and no idea is bad necessarily. They're taking all ideas and they're weighing them on their merit very, very quickly, and they're providing feedback and even executing contracts in just breathtaking pace. And the money's being found. Domestic operations, domestic preparedness money has dried up in the past few years, and that's changing. They realized that they had let their capabilities dwindle or wither, and now they're throwing money at it. Not just emergency management, but also hospital management, and using big data and AI to figure out stress points in the system. And Dynamis is responding to all of that, and we're, as solutions providers, we are in a unique position to rapidly give them what they're looking for.
That's fascinating, man, and frankly, just amazing. I'm thinking about how that's changed, and hopefully, for the better in the future. I think that as a final question, we're going to wrap up here shortly. You sort of alluded to the potential change in terms of how the government is buying and adopting technology. in there. And I'd be curious if you have any additional thoughts about how that may change and change the way the government operates, adopts technology, deploys it, in looking towards the future.
Well, government agencies are forced to work full-time remote now. And there's always been a pushback in the federal space to work remote. You always had to, go to your agency, or for the Air National Guard or the Air Force, you had to go to your base. Well, that's changed. Everyone's working remotely. So the good of that, and I think that's going to move to be more of a permanent thing. I think people are realizing that they don't have to always go into the office to get their job done. And we're all, as we're discovering here, Zoom, among other things, allows you to work virtually. So I do think more government agencies are going to adopt full-time remote work, which means contracting officers are going to be working remote, and they're going to be more focused and responsive. They're not going to get caught up in meetings in the office or have someone come into their office to distract them. They're going to be able to execute contracts and issue funds in a much faster timetable, I think permanently. As we're seeing right now, and this is kind of a unique time, but I think it's going to be more permanent, that we're going to see a quicker turnaround in general on proposals. You're not going to get those long lead times. I think that's going to impact technology and how the government purchases technology. They're going to want to buy technology that's going to make an immediate difference. Technology purchases to date have had long lead times and had to go through a number of different hurdles to be adopted by the government. And I think they're going to approach more agile solutions. Shorten your buying cycles, buy technology that's going to make a difference now, evaluate it in the field, and if it doesn't work with a shorter contract, you move on to the next piece of technology.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense to me, and thanks for that. I think we are at time, and I want to be respectful of all the folks that have spent a day with us. Tom, that was fabulous. I enjoyed speaking with you. I'm quite sure that the folks that are listening enjoyed it, learned something. So thank you very, very much for spending the time with us. It was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you, and it really was my pleasure to share.
Great. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael Gleason for one last time. We're going to look at that ficus, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Huge appreciation for all the speakers, all the panelists, all the attendees.